Quentin, you'll have to excuse my English pronunciation here. Is it Verreycken? Is it?
Yes, it's perfect.
Who's a first-year doctoral student at the French-speaking Catholic University of Louvain. He'll be his PhD actually covers military pardons granted to soldiers in the 15th century. And it's a European-wide project which takes in the Low Countries, France and England. His talk today is entitled The Shaping of a Military Identity in the 15th century Burgundian State, Pardons Granted to Soldiers by the Dukes of Burgundy, 1386 to 1477. So if I can pass it over.
Thank you. Before starting this talk, I have to make a short confession. I've seen the panel outside, Dead to the French, and I feel myself a bit scared because, as you can hear with my accent, I'm a French speaker. So I hope that anything will happen to me, and please remember that I'm Belgian. I'm from the Burgundian state. Even though we were enemies at the Agincourt battle, we are also allies in other situations. So please be merciful with me, and also please forgive my terrible pronunciation and my inaccuracy in speaking English. So, at the end of my childhood, at the age of being able to ride a horse, I went to Lille to the Duke Charles of Burgundy, once called Count of Charolais, who took me at his service. This sentence opens the book of the famous 15th century memorialist Philippe de Comines, a Flemish writer who served the King of France, Louis XI. Here, Comines starts his narration when he first joined the Duke Charles the Bold. With these words, Comines does not only refuse to narrate his early life or his education, he also employs a stereotyped formula that insisted on a popular warrior ethos of the time, that is, the claim of the military service performed to the prince. In the so-called Burgundian states, which combined the principalities of the Low Countries and the duchy and county of Burgundy, in this Burgundian state, the troops were temporarily raised thanks to the feudal service. This, however, changed with the 1471 reform of Charles the Bold, which created a standing army, the so-called ordnance companies, or in French, compagnie d'ordonnance. In a 1472 military settlement, the Duke enjoined his soldiers to take the oath of, I quote the text, serving him and being good and loyal to him. The following year, Charles introduced a collective military training for all his troops, a training which implied to teach them, and I quote the text again, the love they must have to the Duke and the exaltation of his house, and also their own honor and fame, which consist in the fact that the Duke, by the means of their good services, achieves to repulse his enemies. All these dispositions were, according to me, the institutionalization of the military ethos of the time. Since the beginning of the 15th century, soldiers had understood that the advantages brought by their own valorization of the military service. The claim of the military past became a frequent argument for the nobility implied in legal disputes and trials. In remission letters, the use of the argument of the military service increased as well. You can see on the picture my translation of the beginning of a remission granted to Edmond de Toubeauville in 1473, which is quite similar to the beginning of Philippe de Comines' memoirs. The supplicant insists on the fact that he served the Duke as soon as he was able to ride a horse and never stopped to do it. Yet, historians who have read 15th century's narrative and judicial sources know that soldiers were far from being depicted positively in popular opinion. The depredation of the militaries during the Hundred Year Wars contributed to shape a negative stereotype of the soldiers assimilated to brigands and plunderers. Some remission letters testified this general hostility against soldiers, like this man from the town of Termonde, who in 1457 blamed a fighter by saying that he and all the other soldiers go to war only to rob and pillage. This man also complained that, and I quote him again, "It is a pity that we do not hang them all." Alternatively praised and revealed, soldiers were ambivalently depicted in 15th century sources. If we focus specifically on remission letters, it appears that the man of war was a frequent protagonist of the narration, as the actor of or the victim of an act of violence. In the present conference talk, I will study the representation of men of war in remission letters granted by the Duke of Burgundy during the 15th century. By examining the ways the soldiers portrayed themselves in their petitions, I will argue that the granting of remission letters contributed to the shaping of a military identity at the end of the Middle Ages. The priestly right to pardon and to grant remissions, inspired by the French procedure, was progressively regularized in the Low Countries when the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, became Count of Flanders in 1386. A remission letter can be defined as a chancery act whereby the prince grants his pardon after an offense, suspending the ordinary process of justice. To obtain such a letter, a person who committed a crime had first to address a petition or a supplication to the prince and his private council. The case was then examined, and if it was judged positively, a remission letter was granted by the chancery and copied in the chancery records. To be definitely pardoned, the supplicant had, however, to face a last step in the pardoning procedure: the endorsement of his letter by local justice. In most of the cases, the jurisdiction which originally had the ability to judge the crime. In purely diplomatic terms, a remission letter was divided in two major parts. The first one was the narratio, or preamble. It was based on the original petition of the pardon beneficiary, and this text narrates the circumstances of the crime the supplicant committed. The second major part of the text was the dispositio, exposing the legal disposition of the document. It contained the formula of the pardon granted by the prince, and because the narration of the crime in a remission letter was based on the supplication of the petitioner, historians have to consider it carefully. The supplicant who wanted to be pardoned had to use narrative strategies in order to obtain the prince's sympathy. The narration of the crime in a petition was a subtle deformation of the truth by the petitioner, who had reasons to lie and twist his crime into an accident or a case of self-defense in order to make it pardonable. From 1386 until 1661, all the copies of remission letters produced by the Chancery of Flanders-Burgundy were recorded in the Registre de l'Audience, audiency records of the Chamber of Accounts in Lille, presently preserved in the Archives départementales du Nord in Lille. From September 1386 to December 1476, or in other words, from the beginning of the reign of Philip the Bold to the end of that of Charles the Bold, the registers contain more than 750 copies of remission letters, abolition letters, and letters of return of banishments, that's all different sorts of pardon letters, granted by the Dukes of Burgundy to their subjects. The series, and you can see that on the chart, the series is however incomplete since the registers are interrupted from 1393 to 1438. There was a large variety of profiles among the numerous pardon beneficiaries. The nobility was overrepresented, even though it was only the little nobility, considering that aristocracy used other means to escape judicial repression. The elites were not only the ones to deserve a pardon. Most of the supplicants were laborers and modest workers. Moreover, I have noticed that nothing but 116 letters, in other words, around 15% of the corpus, were granted to persons who served or formerly served the Duke in his armies. 3 other pardons were also granted to supplicants who will be pardoned in exchange of future military service. American historian Andrew Villalon calls this letter military pardons, and these pardons can be characterized by a statement usually consisting of no more than a few words linking its issuances to either past or future military service. Of course, such a weight of military pardons in the archive is highly significant, considering that military demography never reached 15% of the global population, but rather 2 or 3% at max. Among these 119 military pardons, 38 were actually granted to soldiers who committed a crime during the military service. The 78 other pardons were granted to former soldiers or individuals who joined the army after the commission of the crime. The chronological repartition of this corpus of almost 120 letters, you can see on this chart, deserves some commentaries. In spite of the interruption of the registers, we can observe a striking increase of military pardons under the reign of Charles the Bold, and specifically during the years 1474 to 1475. During this period, the Duke was at war and besieged the imperial city of Neuss between June 1474 and July 1475. During this period, Charles granted 14 remissions to soldiers who committed a crime during the military service and during the siege itself. However, the following year, 1476, not a single remission was delivered to criminal fighters. The military pardons delivered this year were obtained by former soldiers or fugitives who joined the armies after the commission of the crime. Such a change in the Duke's pardoning policy can be explained by the military context of the time. In 1476, Charles lost several important battles and was in difficulty. As a result, the Duke reinforced the military discipline in his armies. On the one hand, he ceased to grant pardons to his soldiers, and on the other hand, he promulgated a legal text, the Military Ordinance or Military Settlement of 1476, which introduced capital punishment as the main sentence for most of acts of disobedience committed in the armies. Ultimately, this turn during the year 1476 demonstrates that in the Burgundian armies, pardon delivery was first the product of a judicial policy led by the prince in accordance with the legislation he promulgated and which depended on his military situation. Who were these soldiers who committed a crime at war? The study of the 38 remission letters granted to criminals who committed a crime in the armies allow me to underline the socio-economic disparity of the supplicants. Most of them give only few information on their identities to the readers, except for their names and their birthplaces or their residences. Some of them mention their status in the armies, and we can see that one term 1/3 of these 38 military pardons were granted to archers or military servants. 3 remission letters were delivered to men-at-arms, that is to say, combatant from the nobility. A pardon was also granted to 3 gunners, and in addition to the military status, 15 letters insist on the nobility of the supplicant or his bastard condition or his civil profession out of the armies. By evocating their military status or their civilian professions, what do these supplicants tell us about their own condition as soldiers? Understanding or pardon beneficiaries considering that military condition first requires to investigate the context of the military service itself. As I mentioned in the introduction, until 1471, the Burgundian state did not possess any permanent standing army. The recruitment of the troops was based on feudal obligation of subjects, but the rise of the ordnance companies based on volunteering changed the situation, even though the military service continued to be an obligation to every adult male subject of the Duke of Burgundy. Unfortunately, most of remission letters do not mention if the supplicant joined the armies as a volunteer or by obligation. Yet, the military service did not have the same signification for every pardon beneficiary. A nobleman educated in the chivalric culture of honor and warfare had a different attitude at war from, for example, a laborer whose main preoccupation was to protect his land, and a militiaman archer did not behave like a foreign mercenary in search of pay and loot. Considering the multiplicity of status and conditions in the Burgundian armies, the so-called Burgundian soldiers cannot be considered as a coherent and homogeneous socio-professional category. Thereby, the beneficiaries of military pardons were also from various conditions, and they did not experience the military service in the same way, even though most of them did not give any information about this in their petitions. As Andrew Villalon's definition of military pardons underlines, the military service was a good motivation to obtain a remission letter in the 15th century. For supplicants, mentioning their military past was a major argument to catch the prince's sympathy, as well as their good reputation or their familial obligations. This explains why the mention of the military service is frequently used at the end of the narration of a letter to motive the petition, and you can see an example here. In some cases, the evocation of the military past was the major argument of the supplication and took more words than the description of the crime itself. And you can see an example here. Of course, I will not read it, but you can see in bold letters that's the description of the military service, and the text under the underlined text is the description of the crime itself, which is smaller than the description of the military service itself. The mention of the military service as a clear motivation for petitioning occurs in 29 letters out of 38, and some of them even repeat it several times. This, of course, seems logical, considering that since the argument of the military service was a motive to pardon, most of soldiers will certainly use it in their petitions. Such a conclusion is, however, problematic if we investigate the petitioning practices of petitioners in other late medieval states. For example, the recent critical edition of the remission letters granted by the Duke of Lorraine René II between 1473 to 1508 shows that among 383 remissions preserved in the archives, 11 were granted to soldiers who committed a crime in the armies. However, only one of these soldiers uses the argument of the military service as a motivation for petitioning. This suggests that the repeated mention of the service to the prince was a specificity of Burgundian remission letters. Such a valorization of the military service came together with the systematic tendency of the supplicants to describe the crimes they petitioned for in a favorable way. The supplicants were not only good and loyal soldiers, they also used violence legitimately. It is indeed surprising to observe that from September 1386 to December 1476, no pardon was granted to a Burgundian soldier for war crimes like robbery or plundering. We can assume that the pardoned criminality of Burgundian soldiers was not different from the rest of the population. Why? Because the large majority of remission letters examined here concerned interpersonal violence. More than 80% of our corpus concerns homicides committed by vengeance or in self-defense. We have only few cases of assault and theft. Moreover, 15 letters out of 38 concerned interpersonal violence between men of war, with no application of any civilian. This suggests that the pardoned criminality of soldiers was not only directed towards ordinary population. Such an assertion, of course, does not mean that the effective criminality of soldiers never implied violence against civilians, or that Burgundian soldiers never pillaged or robbed. In fact, several narrative sources of the time insist on the money troubles caused by men of war. What the remission letters, however, demonstrate is that the Duke of Burgundy refused to pardon such crimes. He refused to pardon pillaging, robbery, or plundering because such comportments were opposed to the model of the good military servant the prince promoted. Yet, soldiers were not systematically depicted positively in remission letters. We can observe an illegitimate use of violence by Burgundian soldiers when they were the victims of the crimes the supplicants petitioned for. Despite an evasive description of the victim's identity in most of remission letters, 15 letters describe various situations in which the violence of the soldiers was directed against other men of war, as I've just mentioned. Hierarchical conflicts, disputes of housing, financial issues were some of the most frequent causes of shuffle and fights between soldiers. In these occasions, the supplicants do not hesitate to insist on the bad behavior of the victims as a soldier. Lazy, aggressive, and bellicose, these victims were described as terrible elements of the armies. You have here few examples of these terrible elements of the armies. In addition to the 38 remission letters granted to soldiers who committed a crime in the armies, the registers also contained 8 other letters delivered to civilians, no soldiers, to civilians, who killed Burgundian soldiers. 4 remissions insist on violent acts perpetrated by these men of war on ordinary population. In 2 cases, a group of soldiers attacked and pillaged a village, which, in one case, included an assault against a pregnant woman, provoking a premature childbirth and the death of the baby. In another letter, the supplicants, 5 laborers, tried to prevent 3 soldiers to rape a woman who was also pregnant. A last remission also described how soldiers assaulted the supplicants because they were not able to indicate the direction of the rest of the armies. What these few cases suggest is that, depending on the quality of the supplicant, the description of the so-called bad soldiers may vary. When the supplicant was himself a combatant, He depicted his victim as a terrible member of the armies, the opposite of what he, the petitioner, was. On the contrary, when the supplicant was a civilian, he insisted on the crime perpetrated by the victim on population. Thereby, the victim corresponded to the stereotype of the plunderer and brigand. To conclude this short talk, in remission letters granted by the Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century, soldiers appeared as frequent but defaced protagonists of the narrations, alternately described as loyal servants of the sovereign, terrible elements of the armies, or persecutors of the population. The tendency of military supplicants to represent themselves as loyal servants of the prince was coherent with their positive narrations of the crimes they petitioned for. Because they were good soldiers, they also used violence in a legitimate way, with moderation. On the contrary, the victim soldiers was described as a terrible member of the armies, a violent and angry person. This double impetus of the promotion/stigmatization of the man of war can, of course, be explained by the context of the production of the narration of the crime, considering that the supplicants were trying to justify their acts in order to obtain a pardon. But we can also argue that the use of such an argumentative strategy was the result of the ducal promotion of a certain kind of behavior. Petitioners insisted on their military services because they knew that this will catch the attention of the prince. The good soldier, as it is depicted in remission letters, is first a model promoted by the Duke of Burgundy himself. When the priest favored the military service, restrained the access to his mercy for his soldiers, and accepted to pardon civilians who killed bad soldiers, was not he disciplining his armies? The military legislation of Charles the Bold underlines his disciplinary enterprise as well as his structural reformation of the Burgundian armies. Thereby, the military identity promoted was first based on the loyal military service. And to finally conclude this discussion, I will make here the hypothesis that remission letters granted to soldiers during the last decades of the Middle Ages can be analyzed by historians as a source of the shaping of a new military ethos, a military ethos bonded with the Reformation process called the military revolution of the early modern period. Such an assertion naturally deserves further developments. I cannot start here, considering that this will lead us too far from the 15th century. Thank you.